I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
Puny god.
Hi, I'm Justin Barrett, president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a psychological scientist and a former university professor. Thanks for tuning in here. What I'd like to do in this episode is to reply to a question that was posted for me by one of the viewers. The question went like this. Hello, doctor. Hope you're doing well. I have a question that the slot you mentioned, which is naturally present in children's minds, do you think that these slots have any kind of connection with evolution over time?
Amazing! It evolved into Charizard.
One way of putting the question is the God-shaped hole that I referenced in a previous video an evolved feature of what it means to be a human being? So that's what I'd like to discuss briefly today. I thought it deserves more than just a little text response in the comments section. So here we go. In a previous video, I mentioned my book, Born Believers, and my thesis in there about that humans naturally develop by virtue of just being human beings, growing up in natural human environments, with minds that have sort of conceptual spaces, readiness to acquire certain kinds of ideas. And one of those spaces is for some kind of being that looks a lot like what we would call God. Now, I refer to that as sort of a conceptual hole or a God-shaped slot or a shape. Think of those shape sorter toys from preschool where you put in the triangle shaped one and the round shaped one and the square shaped one. You got to find the right shape to go in the right hole. Well, think of our minds as having those slots, those holes where the right shaped cultural inputs will go in and fit nicely, or have to be crammed into that space.
Guess which spot that goes
The square.
That's right. It goes in the square hole.
Yes. Okay.
And so what I've suggested is we have lots of scientific evidence that I review in the book, Born Believers, scientific evidence for those slots being there, those shapes, particularly a God-shaped kind of space. Now, the question that I take it to the viewer is asking is, well, is that slot an evolved kind of slot? Or to put it in slightly different kind of language, is it an adaptation that we have this natural propensity to believe in something like a God? And the answer is sort of, well, I don't think that's quite the right way to talk about it, but that doesn't mean there isn't a connection with human evolution. So let me explain. The God-shaped conceptual space is a product of, at least on my view, lots of different gadgets, cognitive gadgets or devices of the human sort of mind that themselves may have been adaptations for other sorts of things. For instance, we've got a natural propensity to scan around the world and look for what we call intentional agents, beings that think, that motivate, or that are motivated by themselves, that act, that plan, that try to do stuff and not merely react to the things around them. Intentional beings like human beings. We might extend it to other kinds of animals. And they're so important to us in terms of survival that we selectively attend to them and we reason about them through this sort of gadget in our heads that we sometimes call the mind reading system or the theory of mind or mentalizing. There's lots of disagreement over what's the right jargon to use among cognitive developmental psychologists. Our theory of mind system then is one of these things in there that's looking for agents in the environment. We've got a face detection mechanism that's looking for face-like things out there. When it goes, woo, that's exciting, a face. And it gets really excited when it sees a mask or something with the eyes and the mouth are exaggerated, because those are the kind of features that really pop out, make the signal stronger versus background noise and stuff. So we call that super stimuli. So that face-shaped slot is looking for face shapes kinds of inputs, and then that system activates. Okay, well, some of these devices, like that theory of mind system, like what's sometimes been called teleofunctional reasoning, I explained some of these in the other video, they all together create something that looks a little bit like a God-shaped space. So what I'm saying is this God-shaped conceptual space isn't a single thing all by itself that is an adaptation. an evolutionary adaptation, but it's a product of lots of other evolutionary adaptations. So by nature, humans have lots of these different adaptations that are sort of, you might think of psychological or cognitive adaptations, that together they create a new space. And that new space looks a little bit like a god, okay? So in that sense, I'm part of the camp of theorists working in the cognitive science of religion who sort of, we consider ourselves byproduct theorists. Or that is, we think that propensity to believe in something like God is a byproduct of other kinds of adaptations, but is not necessarily think of it as a genetic adaptation all by itself. It's a byproduct instead. Evolved, yes, but not in that straightforward way that we think of, like a face detection mechanism would be an adaptation that sort of evolved all by itself for what it does. But rather, the God-shaped space seems to be pieced together or a byproduct of these other kinds of factors. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, depends how you think of it. Some people, and myself included, I tend to think, well, I actually am more comfortable with that kind of an idea than there being a single evolved device or faculty that's a God faculty that was evolved for a particular reason. And my reasoning for this is simply that lots of us have disabilities of one sort or another, or weaknesses in some of our cognitive faculties. And what if somebody had a weakness in their God-shaped faculty? Well, then that person would be, it seems like, sort of disadvantaged in coming to a relationship with God. And that seems like an unfortunate situation if having a relationship with God really is as important as many of us think it is. Instead, what I've proposed, and what I think is best supported by the available science, is that there are lots of different mechanisms that all sort of nudge us in the direction of some belief in something like God. And so you could lose one or two of those, or be weaker or stronger in one or two, or even three of those. And yet you still have conceptual resources that kind of nudge you in the direction of thinking about a God of some sort or another. Now, I should add, for the sake of fairness to my colleagues out there, there are some colleagues of mine that work in the cognitive and evolutionary studies of religion who do think religious beliefs are something of an adaptation. So not everybody's a byproduct theorist. I happen to be one. Those others who think that believing in something like a morally interested high God, a God who is interested in lots of people in lots of places, is an adaptation. But usually by an adaptation here, they mean something a little different than the usual kind of adaptation, like having lots of body hair or something like that, or some other kind of adaptation. What they're thinking of is a cultural adaptation. Okay, so for instance, Aaron Zion, in his book, Big Gods, lays out one version of this thesis. And the basic idea is, look, there are these building blocks, these cognitive building blocks that those of us who are in the byproduct camp like to talk about, and is the background to my Born Believers thesis. But he says that's not enough, because, wow, belief in these high gods that are morally interested seem to go beyond what that conceptual space is. It's like it fills in more details than what just the regular adaptations in our head seem to push us toward. So there needs to be something else on top of that. And the suggestion is, yeah, it's then a cultural adaptation, in that cultures that have high gods who are morally interested have managed to grow bigger, more cooperative societies that are more diverse, aren't all related to each other, that are bound together because of that morally interested high god sort of looking out after them, keeping an eye on things, getting them to behave, getting them to cooperate in ways that are hard to get them to cooperate otherwise, motivating rituals that bind them together, that form bigger and more mighty societies that then outcompete other societies. So the suggestion would be, if you are a society of, say 150 people, and you've got a high god, you are able to grow into an even bigger society that then gives you advantages over the society that didn't have a high God belief, okay, but maybe had a God belief, but not terribly morally interested, or is a much more local God. So the big gods win out over the little gods, push them out of the picture, and eventually, through cultural evolution, you get lots of big God societies like we have today.
I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
Puny God.
I am not completely convinced by the thesis, but I think it's an interesting thesis. It's an intelligent thesis, and it does capture some interesting features of anthropology, of history, and of human psychology. So it's worth taking seriously. I'm not in that camp. I'm in the byproduct camp for the moment. So I hope this is helpful in further explaining what I mean by the Born Believers thesis, and that this God-shaped slot is not an adaptation, but that doesn't mean it isn't evolved as a byproduct of other kinds of adaptations that we have for navigating the world as humans do. Thanks for joining me. For reference, you can look back at that previous episode concerning Born Believers. As always, if you have further questions or comments, please share them. Like I said before, I do try to answer them if I think I have something worth answering, either in the comments or, as you see, by creating new videos. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.